George H.W. Bush was President of the United States. Israel and Palestine were in a war known as the First Intifada. The CIA was preparing to invade Panama to remove Noriega. And Paula Abdul was dominating the Billboard charts with songs like Straight Up and Cold-Hearted Man. But as a 10-year-old child, I was singing a different tune. My fourth grade class at Farmersville Elementary School was getting ready for an end-of-the-year performance in front of our parents and the entire student body. And the song we were learning to sing was called Recycle. To truly appreciate this story, you need to understand that it was the late 80s, which was a very strange and yet wonderful time for music in American history. The song Recycle was somewhere between Depeche Mode and Run DMC. It was written at a time when white people had no qualms about humiliating themselves or their children by singing badly written versions of rap music. And the lyrics to Recycle went like this: recycle, recycle, recycle now. It doesn't matter if you don't know how. Tell your mother and your brother and your sister too. Recycling is the thing to do. I'm not joining the choir after. Recycle was the moment my conscience first awakened to the issue of environmental justice. And you might imagine that it would be a natural progression from there to the point where I am standing here before you today, but it was most certainly not. The very next year, our fifth grade class performed a play at the end of the year, also in front of the parents and the entire student body. But this time, I was not a backup singer. I had a lead role in the show as the plucky comic relief. And the name of the play that we performed that year was called The Quest for Columbus. As a child, I was far too naive to know that Columbus was not a man we should be glorifying in a play, that we should not be performing this musical, and that our celebration of the great colonizer was undermining all of our fourth grade efforts to recycle. One day I would grow up to come to reject Columbus and the idea of colonialism that came along with that, but at the time I saw nothing wrong with what we were doing, and neither did any of my teachers or our parents. No one had any problem with the children singing Recycle in fourth grade and The Quest for Columbus in fifth grade. And that's because we had no idea how the history of colonization was related to the issue of environmental destruction. Things haven't changed much over the years. This past weekend, we were hosting, as many of you know, the annual gathering of the Alliance of Baptists, and the theme this year was decolonizing the Great Commission. And a pastor friend of mine who was a little older than me that was there, I've known him for many years, and he was complaining about the theme. He's a white pastor, and he was complaining that, it's just another way to talk about race, this decolonization thing. And all we ever do is talk about race here. And so someone asked him, what should we be talking about instead? And he said, other issues like sexuality or the environment. My pastor friend clearly thought colonization has nothing to do with sexuality or the environment. So it turns out the Great Commission is not the only thing that needs to be decolonized. We need to decolonize our concept of environmental justice as well. 2 years ago, at a book launch in London, 19-year-old Greta Thunberg said, "What we refer to as normal is an extreme system built on the exploitation of people and the planet. It is the system," she said, "defined by colonialism, imperialism, oppression, and genocide by the so-called global north, to accumulate wealth that still shapes our current world order. She's not alone. A 2021 report from Greenpeace UK was similar when it claimed the environmental emergency cannot be understood without reference to the history of British and European colonialism, which set in motion a global model for racialized resource extraction. The environmental emergency, they wrote, is the legacy of colonialism, which established a model through which the lands of the global South have been used as a place to extract resources that the global North desires and to dump waste it does not want. A term has emerged in academic circles at the turn of the 21st century called the Anthropocene epoch. Have you all heard this term? It refers to an era when the collective activities of human beings began to substantially alter the Earth's surface, the atmosphere, the oceans, the vegetation, the wildlife. The word Anthropocene has now been cited more than 1,300 times in scholarly journals all over the world and has taken on a life of its own. We're living in what they call is the Anthropocene. But scholars have a wide range of disagreement on when this epoch began. Most believe it began in the 20th century, during the post-World War II years of the 50s or the 60s, but Black and indigenous scholars have critiqued that perspective by reminding their colleagues that environmental catastrophe didn't begin with industrialization or World War II, but with the advent of the colonial enterprise. European colonialism, they say, ushered in the greatest forms of environmental devastation in human history. In his groundbreaking work, Changes in the Lands, Indians, Colonists, and the Ecology of New England, historian William Groaning offers a compelling analysis of the ecological transformations that occurred during the European settlement of New England. His central argument is that the arrival of Europeans brought profound changes to the region's ecology. By examining historical records and diaries and other primary sources from the time, Groaning exposed that extensive alterations took place in the landscape. Native Americans living there already had long practiced a form of land management that had a minimal impact on the environment. Through methods such as burning and selective hunting and agriculture, they had maintained a delicate balance that allowed the region's ecosystem to flourish. However, when European settlers arrived, the balance was disrupted forever because the colonists had a fundamentally different approach to land use called resource exploitation. Groaning argues that European focus on private property, land ownership, and profit-driven economic activities led to the rapid destruction of forests and the alteration of rivers and streams and the decline of plant and wildlife populations. Colonists viewed the land as a commodity to be exploited for personal gain, which Groaning claims resulted in unsustainable practices that had long-lasting negative effects on New England ecology. This was not just true in New England, though. It happened all over the globe. Everywhere European colonists went in the world, they created environmental disaster. And there was something, you remember, about these colonists. They were followers of Jesus, they said. But there was something toxic inside their Christianity that the colonists brought with them to the places that they traveled. They had come to believe that the earth was something that could be owned, possessed, exploited, used, commodified. This idea was derived from a diseased interpretation of Genesis 1, where it's typically translated, "Let us make humanity in our image, according to our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea and the birds of the air and the cattle and all the wild animals of the earth and over every creeping thing upon the earth." But the Hebrew word translated as dominion, radah, did not mean dominate over, as a king would dominate over his subjects, using them for his own ends, pleasure, privilege, prestige, wars. No, close examination of the word radah shows that it is a term of responsibility, not rulership. Radah means to live for the sake of something else, for the sake of something we've been given responsibility for, to live for the sake of creation, not over it. It is not surprising that it was Roman imperial Christianity that was the first to interpret Genesis 1 in this way, as a command to dominate the land, instead of as a command to steward and to care for it. The early church baptized a lot of horrible Roman ideas, including their views on ecology, which might have been the worst thing that we ever adopted. In a book called Environmental Problems of the Greeks and Romans, J. Donald Hughes argues that environmental destruction was widespread in Paul's time, and that ancient authors such as Vitruvius, Strabo, Aristotle, Theophrastus not only described but denounced environmental devastation. They knew that imperial economic policies wrought destruction for people and land, which Hughes in his book graphically shows resulted from the combined impact of Roman military practices, agricultural technology, economic practices, and population relocation, which were all widespread in Galilee and Judea at the time. Rome and its Caesars claimed at the time that they were the source of the renewal of all creation, but history tells a much different story. Roman military victories often required destroying the infrastructure of entire communities that they conquered, and the establishment of a continued Roman occupation, which created ongoing exploitation of the people in the land. As the Roman historian Tacitus famously wrote, "The Romans are the plunderers of the world. After exhausting the land by their devastations, they rifle the ocean, all stimulated by their greed. They ravage, slaughter, and usurp under false titles and call it empire. They make a desert and they call it peace." Paul would have been living at a time where he would have seen that decades of military occupation and the toll that it had had on the environment, how the expansion of imperial estates created the loss of familial lands and the despair that accompanied such violence and degradation over the years and created more poverty over poverty for the people. So when Paul comes along in Romans 8 and offers us this graphic description of the suffering of creation, it would have been heard at the time by the people and by the Jewish authorities and by the Roman officials as a prophetic critique of environmental catastrophe, a prophetic critique of Roman policy, a prophetic critique of their dominant ideology of renewing creation that was simply a facade for violent land-destroying practices. In the words of the Jewish writer Jacob Taubes, Paul's letter to the Romans was a political declaration of war on the empire. When the letter like this was sent to a congregation, it was always meant to be read aloud. No one ever knew if it would fall into the wrong hands. And this particular letter was sent to a burgeoning community of Jesus followers in the capital of the largest and most destructive empire the world had ever seen to date. Make no mistake, the epistle to the Romans may be a letter, but it is a protest letter. And while Paul has been misinterpreted and misused by evangelical Christians for centuries as the darling child of all the worst forms of oppression in history, like slavery and patriarchy and homophobia, the real Paul was a Jewish anti-imperialist who preached a crucified Messiah to the very empire who executed him, and was so effective in his testimony, he was crucified himself in the city of Rome. That's the real Paul. Not the one the evangelicals have conjured. Not the one the liberals have thrown out like a baby with the bathwater. So what was Paul's message for the empire? Very simple. You're killing creation. You're killing humanity. You think you can renew the earth by possessing the land and owning the people. You can't. You think you can renew the earth by exploiting the land and oppressing the people. You can't. No, your violent imperialist actions have done nothing but destroy the earth and everything upon it. Paul told the empire, you have subjected creation in bondage to decay, to death. You've subjected all of humanity to futility, futile efforts at life, while trying to make us all think that you're renewing something, when in reality you've placed the entire world on the path to extinction. And now all of creation and all of humanity are groaning. Everything on the planet is groaning, and all their groaning is a testimony against you. Paul could never have imagined that 2,000 years later his words would be truer than they were in the first century. Everything in our world today is groaning. Creation is groaning. Humanity is groaning. Last year shattered climate change records around the world. Global temperatures reached an all-time high. Droughts, storms, floods, wildfires. Deadly heat surged all across the globe. Antarctic ice melted at a breakneck pace. Glaciers are collapsing, foretelling a sea level rise that makes it only a matter of time before coastal cities, including New York, Tokyo, and Shanghai, disappear. The Secretary General of the United Nations, Antonio Guterres, said, "Record global heat should send shivers down the spines of every world leader." But it doesn't. Does it? Meanwhile, the largest banks in the world, some right here in Charlotte, have been doubling down on fossil fuels, pouring billions into the industry and bankrolling a gallery of climate destroyers. Creation is groaning. Humanity is groaning. Everything is groaning, testifying against us. And there's a reason Paul used the word groaning to describe how creation and humanity is responding to ecological catastrophe. We groan when we are suffering. We groan because we're in pain. We groan because the forces that are pressing down upon us are too heavy to carry in silence, and we can't keep quiet. We groan to let out the energy. We groan to blow off steam. We groan to let loose the trauma that has been stored up inside of us from oppression. We groan to let it all out. We groan to work it out. We groan to release the burden. And throughout the Bible, when creation and humanity have groaned, God showed up. God heard their cries and acted decisively with deliverance. When the Hebrews were enslaved in Egypt, the story says they groaned in pain, and God heard their cries and came and delivered them. When Hagar was starving in the wilderness and set her child Ishmael down nearby so she wouldn't have to watch him die, the story says she groaned for the sake of her child, and her child groaned too, and God heard their cries and came and saved them. Psalm 56 says, "When I cry out to you, O God, my enemies turn back, and I know that you are for me." Psalm 34 says, "The righteous cry, and the Lord hears and delivers them out of their troubles." Psalm 5, "Lend an ear to my words, O God, consider my groaning." Consider my groaning. Pay attention to the sound of my cry, my King and my God, for to you I pray. The psalmist said, notice, consider my groaning, because in the Bible, groaning is not just a bodily reflex. Groaning is a prayer. When we groan, we express our praying to God. To groan is to pray. Which means that when Paul told the church in Rome that creation is groaning, what he meant was creation is praying. Not only was creation praying, Paul said humanity is groaning too, which means that humanity is also praying. And then later Paul said that even when human beings are suffering so much, we don't have the words to say, the Holy Spirit intercedes for us with what? With groaning with sighs too deep for words, which means the Spirit of God prays for us with groaning. Does anybody here today know anything about groaning? Has anybody here ever found yourself groaning? Groaning is the universal language of prayer. God hears us when we are groaning, and groaning is the only prayer I know that earth, human beings, and the Spirit all do. Which means that groaning is the prayer that unites creation and humanity and God in full solidarity. Groaning is one of the most powerful forces in the world. Now, did you notice in this passage here how Paul brought the Roman Empire to its knees with a little groaning? He said, "We know that the whole creation has been groaning together in labor pains until now." And I know it's subtle. It's easy to miss. But Paul basically told the empire, yes, we're suffering. The earth is suffering. Creation is hurting. We are groaning under the weight of your oppressive regime and all the environmental destruction that you have wrought as an empire. But while you think our groaning sounds like the sounds we make before we give up and stop fighting and die, what you don't realize is that these groanings are labor pains. Paul said, we're not just groaning because you're trying to destroy us. We're groaning because we're in the process of giving birth to a new tomorrow. We're groaning with hope and possibility. We're groaning from the work of building a whole new world. We're groaning with labor pains of a new humanity and a new creation and a new earth. Groaning is not a passive activity. Groaning is an act of resistance. Groaning is a testimony that something isn't right. Groaning is a plea for a different world. Groaning is a demand for change. You want to know why we're not making the strides we need to make to address climate change? It's because people of faith like us aren't doing enough groaning. There's that activist group, I don't know if you've seen them, Extinction Rebellion. They're always interrupting different things. And you know what our reaction to that is? A different kind of groaning. But they shouldn't be the only people protesting and interrupting life as we know it in order to bring a radical word to the masses about our impending doom if we don't change. Christians, followers of Jesus, should be doing that as well. We should all be groaning for change, groaning so loudly that our groans interrupt the world's callous indifference. All the recycling and cleaning up efforts and abandoning plastics and using metal straws and eating less meat and planting community gardens and conservation efforts, they are amazing things, and every one of us should be doing them, but they're not going to save the earth or humanity. That's not going to stop the train of destruction. All our efforts at creation care are incredibly important and amazing activities, but tragically, we are long past the time when personal responsibility could save us. In fact, that is one of the profound lessons of this environmental catastrophe and what it has taught us. Systemic problems cannot be resolved with personal solutions. Systemic problems, systemic injustice can only be addressed by collective action. Whenever we avoid addressing systems and focus on individuals, we take the path of least resistance, but it leads to the death knell of human extinction. There's nothing wrong with recycling, so long as we don't delude ourselves into thinking it will save us. We would be waiting on a false messiah, because all the recycling in the world can't make up for the devastation of colonialism. I could sing recycle 5 million times, and it's not going to change the fossil fuel industry. We must get to a point where we people today can live with a little discomfort so the next generation can live it all. That's what it boils down to. And it's going to require some groaning. We must get to a point where true and radical policy change comes that sparks a new beginning for our nation. Things like the Green New Deal, policies that hold nations fully accountable to the Paris climate agreements. Any efforts at environmental justice that do not wrestle with the history of colonialism are simply not serious efforts. What we read right now is not more personal responsibility, but more collective groaning. More groaning in solidarity with creation and with each other and the Holy Spirit. We need more groaning in solidarity with indigenous people across the globe and in communities of color who are most impacted by climate devastation. Groaning is one of the only forces we have at our disposal that has the power to cut through the death cloud of empire and all the denial and what colonization has wrought, and truly bring the world to its knees so it will finally change. And so we have to keep on groaning. We have to embrace the groaning. We have to keep on groaning for hope, and groaning for peace, and groaning for justice, and groaning for equality, and groaning for change. We have to keep on groaning until the world notices. We have to groan as a way to interrupt the way the world is. We have to keep on groaning as a testimony against the forces of destruction. In fact, we have to keep on groaning until the shackles of colonialism fall off all our bodies and all our minds. We have to keep on groaning until the world gets so annoyed and so fed up with our groaning that it gives way to the birth of a whole new reality. We have to let it out. We have to keep on groaning. Don't stop groaning. Keep on groaning for a new tomorrow. Keep on groaning for a new future, groaning for a new beginning, groaning for a new creation. Keep on groaning with labor pains of a people who are trying to give birth to a whole new world. And maybe, just maybe, the world will finally hear us and begin to change. And even if they don't, then God will have had a witness here that testified to another way. Amen.